On today's episode of the new literary detective series, Hunting Out and Solving the Greatest Puzzles in Literature, I am answering a viewer's question. They asked, what was the book that turned Dorian Gray evil? Great question. Now, you probably already know if you've been watching these videos that I love hunting out these fun little puzzles. Who's the character who does not speak in Jane Austen's Persuasion? What book is Anna Karenina reading on the train? Indeed, there are many of these great literary puzzles, and in trying to answer them, the search in itself is very, very illuminating. It tells you a lot about the book, it tells you about the surrounding peripheral literary scene, the socio-historical, cultural influence, and all that great stuff. I actually know the answer to this question by virtue of doing research for the Oscar Wilde podcast. Link in the description below. Check it out if you're interested in The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, firstly, The Picture of Dorian Gray is a wonderful novel by Oscar Wilde. It got him in a lot of trouble, though. We talked about this on the Art is Useless video. He ended up going to trial to defend himself against charges of indecency, immorality, all that sort of thing. It went crazy, and actually, to be honest, those trials were the downfall of Oscar Wilde. After that, and after his jail sentence, he was never really the same again. He limped on through the rest of his life for only a couple of years, drowning in alcoholism. What a shame, because Oscar Wilde is a gem. He's a gem in world literature. He's a great representation of what Irish writers can do. The power, the wit, the humour, and the synesthetic, aesthetic, beautiful, just the beautiful visual qualities that literature is capable of. He is a great representation of the decadent and symbolist movement in the fin de siècle, the turn of the century. He's Gothic through and through. Dorian Gray is Gothic through and through. And one of the mysteries at the heart of Dorian Gray is the book that essentially does turn him evil. The book that Lord Henry Wotton recommends to him. The book that Dorian Gray gets several volumes of and binds in different colours depending on his mood. And he reads many passages out, but Oscar does not actually tell us what this book is. Dorian Gray himself, feeling the evil effect potentially of this book, repudiates it at one point and tries to reject its influence, tries to tell Lord Henry Wotton that this is an evil book that he has on his hands. You poisoned me with a book once. I should not forgive that. Harry, promise me that you will never lend that book to anyone. It does harm. My dear boy, you are really beginning to moralise. You will soon be going about like the converted and the revivalist, warning people against all the sins of which you have grown tired. You are much too delightful to do that. As for being poisoned by a book, there is no such thing as that. Art has no influence upon action. It annihilates the desire to act. It is superbly sterile. The books that the world calls immoral are books that show the world its own shame. Indeed, that's a wonderful quote, and one cannot help but think that this is Wilde putting his own thoughts on aestheticism and morality into Lord Henry Wotton's mouth. If you break apart his preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, in which he says all art is perfectly useless, you'll see his tract, his manifesto on art. Did he believe this all the way through to his end? Did he believe this post-trial? One cannot say. Do you believe it? Do you think that art has no social utility whatsoever and is only to be admired in and of itself? Is that immoral? Is that an immoral viewpoint? Can a book be moral or immoral? Tolstoy would have thought yes. In fact, he deemed one of his own books, his masterpiece, Anna Karenina, to be a deeply immoral book, and he would not read those who he deemed to be immoral, which just so happened to be everybody, including Shakespeare. He exempted Dostoevsky, and I believe he exempted Hugo, Les Miserables. But essentially, there are authors out there that think that literature can be moral, and there are authors in the Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, John Ruskin camp that think art for art's sake. Let me know what you think about that, but let's skip the foreplay and let's just answer the question. What is the book that turned Dorian Gray evil? Now, we can't say with 100% certainty, but I believe I can say with 99.9% certainty that I know what the book is, because when Oscar Wilde was put on trial, they made a real meal of the book that Dorian reads, and they interrogated him and asked him and said, was it ... Was it this book? And Oscar Wilde, though he didn't really completely directly assent, he basically conceded and basically did reveal the book. This is a book that he cherished, that he revered, that he liked. This book was a breakaway from the naturalist movement that was happening in French literature at the time. It was a breakaway from Émile Zola. Indeed, the writer of this book was a disciple of Zola and pissed Zola off by basically moving the goalposts of literature, doing something completely different. Many writers at the time, apart from writers of the symbolist movement, didn't like this book. Anyway, the book is called Aurebor, or Against Nature, by Joris Karl Huysmans. I have 3 editions here, and I'm going to tell you which one is my favourite. The first is this lovely, beautiful hardback, mysterious version. Very nice. The second is a very old, tattered Penguin classic that I paid far too much for, but the introduction is, well, if it manages to stay in the book and not fall out, then it was worth purchasing for the introduction alone. And we've got the Oxford University Press version of Against Nature. My top recommendation for translation would be this one. The other 2 are not as readable, but the runner-up would be this one. This one's translated by Margaret Malden, and it won the Moncrief Prize for Translation. Now, you might recognise the name Moncrief if you know anything about French literature, because Moncrief was responsible for what I believe to be the best translation of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. The Moncrief Kilmartin Enright translation is my top recommendation for Proust. Now, I'm giving you recommendations for a translation because despite what many reviewers will say who've read Aurebor, I think it's a great book. Now, essentially it's plotless. Its central and practically only protagonist is Jean Desessentes, he's a sickly aristocrat who's suffered from so many generations of inbreeding that he's completely effete and weak. He gets tired of the city life, he gets tired of the Parisian scene, and he wants to become a recluse. He wants to hide himself away. He's spent through his inheritance, but he's just enough left to buy a beautiful, stately, museum-like home and spend a few months scouring the city for artworks, reprints, vases, curtains, carpets, rugs, and little smells and beautiful ingredients for meals and stuff. His idea is to make himself a little burrow, a little alcove away from the city life and just indulge aesthetic pleasure. Now, is this immoral? Well, I would implore you to read it because essentially I don't think he does anything particularly immoral, though there is a melancholy running through the book. Indeed, one can most certainly identify with the longing to escape the city, but this seems to be a madness because he holds himself up in this house and he just indulges pleasure, hedonistic pleasure of the senses. There are scenes where he tries to substitute a representation for the actual thing. For example, instead of going on a fishing trip, he can just have a boat and a rod and get the smell of sea spray, and he can form the impression in his mind of a trip without him actually having to do it. He can go and travel to London, but by virtue of decking the place out to look British, he can pretend that he's been there and convince himself that he's actually been there. He does this with everything. He concocts his own potions, his own little perfumes, and he has different rooms and different alcoves of rooms that are decked out in different colour depending on his mood. The book is essentially just that. It's a catalogue of sense impressions, smell, him describing colours and basically furniture, and also his diatribes on literature. Now, you might think that's really boring, and to be honest, it probably is to a lot of people, but I must say, I really enjoyed it. Is it of the quality of Proust, who also feels quite decadent and luxurious? A leisurely read of Proust where you really do indulge the visual and all the different senses. It's not as good as that. But it's not a bad book, and people do trash it. I'm not too sure why. There are a lot of one-star reviews that call it boring. And I suppose if you don't like indulgent, potentially kind of pretentious, long, unwinding descriptions of just things that one sees, then yeah. But I find it very soothing and relaxing. Yes, it does feel a bit sad that this person has completely ostracised himself or exiled himself from society, but there is something quite pleasurable before bed reading a couple of pages and just reading through the prose. It caused a lot of furore at the time, it still causes furore today, and it got Oscar Wilde in trouble because this most certainly was the book I believe that Dorian Gray was kind of obsessed with. If you want to know what Dorian Gray's secret life looked like, then you can basically read this and you'll have an idea of what his lifestyle, sans murder, would have probably looked like. I'll read you a little bit, just a little paragraph, and then maybe just for the lols, we'll look at some reviews. So this is him just providing a sort of synesthetic kaleidoscope of colour. I'm going to read this at length, but it's beautiful, and it is very hedonistic and indulgent, self-indulgent. He's talking about colour and basically the psychology of colour. He's trying to ascertain what kind of people like what kind of colours. Slowly, one by one, he sorted through the shades of colour. By candlelight, blue is almost an artificial green. A dark shade of blue, like cobalt or indigo, turns black. A pale shade turns grey. A true and gentle blue, like turquoise, looks faded and lifeless. So, unless it was coupled with another colour, blue could not possibly be used as the predominant shade in a room. On the other hand, iron greys grow still gloomier and heavier. Pearl greys lose their azure tints and mutate into a dirty white. Browns turn lethargic and cold. As for dark greens, such as emperor green and myrtle green, they behave like bright blues and merge into shades of black. He goes on and says, if you disregard the majority of ordinary mortals, whose coarse retinas can discern neither the peculiar cadence of each colour, nor the mysterious charms of their gradations and their subtleties, if you ignore those bourgeois eyes which are insensible to the ceremonial and triumph of strong, vibrant colours, if you then consider none but those whose discriminating vision has been refined through constant contact with literature and art, he was convinced that the eye of that individual who dreams of ideal beauty, who craves illusions, who seeks some mystery in his women, is as a rule attracted to blue and its derivatives, mauve, lilac and pearl grey, always provided these remain soft in tone and do not cross that boundary where they lose their identity and are transformed into pure violets and forthright greys. By contrast, those men who affect the military style, who are full-blooded, handsome and brash, who scorn society's restraints, fling themselves into things and promptly lose their heads, those men, for the most part, take pleasure in the dazzling brightness of yellows and reds, in the blinding, intoxicating clang of bright reds and chrome yellows. One review, this thing was awful. This is not a novel. I'm fine with novels that reject conventional form, but an author who does that has a duty to come up with interesting things to replace the rejected conventions. Huysmans totally fails in this obligation. Most of this book consists of long, boring catalogues of the things that temporarily capture the attention of the protagonist, such as obscure Latin ecclesiastical works and ugly, unnatural, exotic plants. These lists are endless and nearly pointless. I can probably imagine that a couple of years back I might have not had the patience for this, and I can understand that people who are impatient with the flaneur as a concept in aestheticism might also not want to read this, but I think he does a good job. I think the descriptions are lovely. I think its prose is most poetic. Someone else has said, pretentiously verbose. I spent more time looking up words that I didn't know than I did enjoying any sort of plot, partly because there were a fuck ton of words I didn't know, and partly because there was no plot. Theoretical musings on everyday life in an exceedingly grandiose manner would be my soundbite. That's the thing, it's very aristocratic. But Huysmans himself was a bit of a working class stiff. He wasn't born into money at all. But yeah, I suppose everyday life is a snapshot of everyday life for somebody who's been born into money and wants to pursue hedonism. But again, might not be for everybody. I enjoyed it. This book, someone says, reads like a series of lengthy Yelp reviews written by a neurotic and eccentric dandy. Yeah, what's wrong with that? Discontent with the modern world, Des Esseintes chooses to isolate himself in a chateau where he indulges in all his odd predilections. Listen, I get it, people are the worst, but just because you read Edgar Allan Poe before he was cool doesn't make you unique or interesting. A torture to read and truly a struggle to finish. Yeah, it is very Poe-like, I'll give you that. I've carried this book around with me, says someone else, for over 10 years. Never read it until now. And what a waste of time bothering to do to that was. If you want a book about a rich kid with depression who thinks plebs are worthless subhumans, talk at length about esoteric theologians and this is the book for you. Yeah, he's not wrong. Boring, boring, boring. So boring, says somebody else. And annoying. Someone else. Boring with absolutely no plot. It's like this guy is just coming up with weird crap to do out of boredom. Yeah, I don't know, it might be l'ennui, depressing, soul-crushing boredom, but there is something there. There's a mental health aspect, and there's a conversation to be had about that. People saying, oh, it's about a neurotic, or it's about a crazy person, it's about a depressed man. Well, that, as literature, isn't that useful? Isn't that useful to think through? Anybody who might have thought, well, I need to escape society, what's the cure? Escape into pleasure and narrative and pictures and the fakeness, because we live in a fake world today. Everything we see almost is not real. I know that reality is subjective anyway, but a lot of what we see is an indulgence and is escape from society. So I think it's eminently, like all Gothic texts, completely contemporary, even though it is dated. And actually, if you're finding the language difficult and you need to look up words, get a better translation, because there are some translations that are unreadable. But yeah, there we go. It's the book that turned Dorian Gray evil. I personally don't think it has the potential to turn anybody evil, except probably somebody who was already predisposed towards that. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about Oscar Wilde, Dorian Gray, Aurebor, or anything else. Anything else you want to talk about in regards to all of this. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any recommendations for a future episode for the literary detective series, please drop it in the comments below, and if it's a good one, I will make the video. I'll hunt something out for you. And please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and happy reading.